Welcome, brain owners. My name is Coach Jen. Welcome to Brain Ownership for Couples, Session 1. First off, let me say congratulations on signing up for Brain Ownership for Couples. We, as a group here at Sphere Education, are really looking forward to helping you on this journey. So, we're going to go ahead and get started today with Brain Basics. This is Session 1. We hope you really enjoy this. So, we're going to talk today a lot about the brain. Probably kind of wondering why. Well, it's really important, I think, to understand what's actually going on up here so that you can kind of understand how you interact with the world and especially inside of your relationships. So we're going to tackle a couple of things today. We're going to talk about the biology of the brain. We're going to explore the triune brain. And then we're also going to talk about autopilot and growth systems. Those are the things that actually go on in your brain every day. So let's go ahead and get started with the biology of your brain. One of the first things I'd like to talk about, though, are the common neuromyths. There's so much information out there in regards to the brain, but there is so much we still don't know. But I do want to tackle a couple of things that most of us actually believe that aren't actually true. First, you are neither left-brained or right-brained. We actually use both sides of our brains all the time. But there is that misconception out there that if you're like super statistical and very rational, that you are left-brained, especially if you like math. And then if you're artistic or creative, that you're really a right-brained person. And unfortunately, with all of that sort of information out there, a lot of us get stuck and think we're not creative or we're not very logical or can't handle math. It's just not true. We use both sides of our brains, and yes, there are pieces that are processed on the left side or the right side, but you, my friend, have access to both all the time. And so you can be creative even if you're a math major. And if you're an artist, by the way, you can still do math, probably even calculus if you give it a try. So just know we are not left-brained or right-brained. We simply are a brain and we use both sides. The next one is a lot of people believe that the brain is done developing by the time we're teenagers. Well, that's not true either. Actually, full brain connection and development is kind of done. All the big pieces are done by the time we're 26. However, what we have learned throughout the last, 100 plus years, and actually more in the last 10, is that the brain is very plastic. It is constantly changing, and new neural pathways are made every single day. And you can actually consciously make new neural pathways and change neural pathways as you come into adulthood, and then even as you grow older. And it's really interesting because you can actually the brain continues to be plastic until the day we die. So we want you to know that your brain is plastic. And I always love the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's not true either. You can always teach anybody something new. The next one is that learning is by adding new brain cells. A lot of people think that, we're constantly learning. When we learn, we add new brain cells. Well, we do add brain cells, but really learning is about creating new neural pathways. So if you know something, but you want to learn something new, when you do it, you're actually creating a new neural pathway. You're actually having neurons connect to one another in different ways. So learning is actually all about creating neural pathways, which we can do very consciously. I think it's kind of cool to know that you can actually create a neural pathway by thinking about something. I think that's kind of cool. I hope you do too. We only use 10% of our brain. Now, I know you've heard this because I've heard it, and for a long time I thought it until I started doing this work. We actually use 100% of our brain, but not all the time. The brain is one of the most powerful systems in our bodies. It uses most of our energy. If you think about it, there's billions of neurons firing in there all the time. And so we use our brain all of the time, we're using 100% of it, just not all of it at the same time. Different pieces are turned off and turned on based on what we're doing, but we are using our entire brain. So I think really what we know about the brain is maybe 10% of its abilities, but we're learning something new every day. And the last one, I love to talk about this one. If you ever want to catch me about sleep, people think that when we sleep, our brain shuts down. actually, when we sleep, our brain is more active than it is any other time. We have these things called glial cells that go in and basically clean out the brain. So it's basically like housekeeping's time to come in and clean out all of the rooms and all of the um, neurosynapses. It's in there working all the time. Plus, if you think about it, we don't stop breathing and our heart doesn't stop beating, and we don't stop, gestation or of our food at night. So our brain is on all the time, and at night it's actually doing sort of all of the cleanup and getting you ready for your next day. So those are the common neuro myths that I just wanted to address first, because those are the biggest questions I get when I start talking about the brain. All right, so let's dive into the brain biology. Just so you have an idea, a couple of ways that you understand the brain. So there's three big parts of the brain. The first one is the brain stem, and the brain stem actually sits sort of like right here in the back. As your neck, where your neck hits your head, your brain stem sits right up inside of there. The brain stem is really in charge of our sort of automatic functions. So our heartbeat and our breath and the digestion of food. So all those regular functions that we don't think about are all handled mostly by the brain stem. The other thing is it's sort of the relay center for everything that goes on with our physical bodies. So if you stub your toe, that sensation comes up the nerve center through your body up to the brain, and the first place it gets to is the brain stem. And so the brain stem sort of decides what to do with it and who to tell inside the rest of your brain that, oh, hey, I just stubbed my toe. The next piece is the cerebellum, and it's actually sits sort of behind the brain stem down here at the bottom part. And the cerebellum is more about muscle movement, so waving your hands, but it also helps us maintain good posture, and it helps with balance. So sometimes if you've ever hit your head like back here, you kind of feel off balance. Well, part of that is because that's where balance and posture actually come from. It's how we kind of keep in charge of all of our limbs. And so if you happen to hit your head back here, you might actually feel a little dizzy, solely because that part of the brain had a little jolt and it doesn't know quite how to stabilize itself. The last piece is the cerebrum. It's the big part of the brain. It's kind of like what we all picture, I think, when we think about the brain. It's the big part right here. It is the largest part of the brain, and it is cut into two hemispheres, and it's where basically most of the higher function actually happens. All right, so let's talk about the left brain and the right brain. Okay, so the cerebrum is actually divided into two separate sides, and they are connected actually by something called the corpus callosum. It's a bundle of fibers that cross to the other side. Each hemisphere, and this is, I think, where a lot of that neuro myth comes from, is each hemisphere actually controls the opposite side of the body. So if we actually were saying, oh, you're right-brained or left-brained, so the majority of us are right-handed, so that would mean we were left-brained. But I know a lot of right-handed artists. So that's kind of how we debunk one of those myths too. So what happens on our right side is controlled by the left side of the brain, and vice versa. And so the interesting piece though too is that there's a lot of things that are handled on one side and maybe not the other. So like speech and comprehension, which is more left brain, and then creativity is really more in the right brain, which is again how we got that neuro myth. So just know that a lot of different pieces are handled on either side of the brain, but as a whole, the brain works together. And those fibers, the corpus callosum, actually help the brain talk to each other on either side. There are actually some diseases, and sometimes something happens and they have to sever the corpus callosum. And one of the things that happens is, especially in like recognition of items. So someone who maybe has their corpus callosum severed, they can see an apple, and in their brain on one side, the apple's like, I know that's an apple, I can see it, but the speech on the other side can't tell you it's an apple. The brain knows what it is, but it can't tell you because they can't talk to each other. And so that's really how the left brain and right brain work together. The next piece we're going to talk about are lobes of the brain. So the frontal lobe, this front piece right here, is all about personality, behavior. It's kind of like who you are. And it plays a lot of roles in judgment, planning, problem solving, like when you're at work and you're working on something, or if you're at home with your spouse, your significant other, and you guys are working on a problem. That's where all of this kind of happens. It's also a little bit sort of further back in there is the Broca's area, which is actually where speech comes from. So speaking and writing are both done in that piece. And like I said, it's kind of like sort of right back in behind the eyes. The next piece is the parietal lobe. This is where we interpret language. It also happens to be where our sense of touch, pain, temperature, if it's cold or hot, all of that happens sort of right inside the parietal lobe. And that's so the sense of like touch, pain, temperature is in what's called the sensory strip. It also interprets information from what we see and what we hear, and then also sort of like because it's all in that parietal lobe, the way we touch. So those senses that we have, those five senses, all get done inside there. It also has memory, and so that's really where you can kind of understand the memory part. The next one is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is way back here. It is where vision is interpreted. And so if you've ever hit your head back here and you see stars, that's because you've just hit basically the portion of the brain that interprets what you see through your eyes. And so that's a lot of times when you like hit your head back here, some people are like, oh, I see stars. Well, yeah, that's because you've just jostled the brain in its sort of visual perception areas. We also interpret light and color and different movements inside of the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe, which is sort of like up and under, for a better sort of lack of description, it's where we understand language. It kind of comes up under here, under our ears, which is where our audio cortex is, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. In the temporal lobe, we understand memory, hearing. It's also where we put things together. So understanding like that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or A, B, C, D. It's about sequential things, putting things in order and sequence, and then also about organizing things. So if you have like, these are the 3 things I need to do today to get this done, or when I'm speaking with my spouse, I need to do this, this, and this. That's a lot of that happens in the temporal lobe. So those are sort of a basic overview of the lobes of the brain. All right, now let's talk about those pesky little cortexes. So a cortex is actually the surface of the cerebrum. It is that folded gray matter that we all see and think about as a brain. There are 16 billion neurons in the cortex. So, and they kind of like line up like soldiers in specific layers. And that's how they actually talk to each other. And so that's how like neural pathways are created. So there's a couple I want to cover, and we'll cover them in more detail as we go through the brain ownership for couples. But the first one I want to cover is the prefrontal cortex. That's this piece right here. This is the human portion. This is the very front side of the brain. It develops between the ages of 12 and 26. It is not fully connected to the rest of the brain until we're 26. So the cerebral cortex that covers the frontal lobe is actually the prefrontal cortex. It is where most of our executive function happens. So our ability to think through things, our ability to reason, like, oh, if I said this, my spouse will have this reaction. And so it is really one of the most important pieces of the brain, and it truly is what makes us human and sort of separates us, aside from our thumbs, from the rest of the animal kingdom. All right, so how do we apply this biology to the relationships that we're in, right? Well, understanding your brain is really helpful, I think, because then you can understand how other people, their brains work. And then you understand, like, oh, so they might be thinking this way, or they might be thinking it this way because of the way their brain works. It really helps us be aware of others. The last piece, too, for really understanding the brain and biology and our relationship is there are so many working pieces to our brains that it's kind of amazing that we actually are able to like be fully cognitive beings in our day-to-day relationships and in our day-to-day lives. All right, let's move on to the triune brain. Now, this isn't any different. We're not talking about a separate brain. We're actually just going to take a look. So we talked about, excuse me, we talked about the brain sort of as the pieces. Now we're going to kind of look down on the brain and how they kind of line up. So the triune brain, if you actually were up here and looking down in the brain, it kind of hits the brainstem. It's the primitive brain. It is responsible for the survival functions, your heart beating, your breathing, your temperature regulation, okay? So again, what we're doing when we talk about the triune brain is looking down from the top into the middle. So it kind of puts those three circles together. The primitive and reptilian brain, the functions sort of take precedent over anything. Our heart has to beat and we have to breathe. We have to maintain a body temperature so that all of our internal organs continue to function. And its sole job is survival. And it will force survival. And one of the ways I love to talk about this is like if you know any young children, they'll be like, I'm going to hold my breath until I pass out. Well, great, go for it. The thing is the brain will force the cognitive or the stupid part to shut off if we're trying to hold our breath. The reason we pass out is because the brain, once we've passed out, the brain finally gets to take over and it'll start breathing again. Unfortunately, this is what happens a lot of times if somebody drowns. If we've passed out, the brain will start to function. It'll cause the breathing to happen anyway. And if you're in water, that's not very good. All right. The next sort of circle out is our limbic system or the emotional brain. It is in charge of the fight or flight response. This is where our amygdala, and we're going to talk a lot about the amygdala when we talk about emotion, but it is the emotional system. It is our sort of first response to the things that we experience. A lot of times people like, I can really, I can tell you if I'm trying to sell you a car. I can absolutely give you all the reasons you should buy this car. But if it just doesn't feel right, that's where that limbic emotional brain comes in. All right. It is that first response, and we can misinterpret the cues in the body, and it sends the body into a stress response. Excuse me. So we can actually, the limbic emotional brain can actually cause the body to go into a stress response. But we're going to talk way more about the emotional brain when we get into the emotional awareness session. The last piece of the triune brain that I want to talk about is called the new cortex or the smart brain. This is where all of our conscious activity happens. So it's kind of that outside piece. This is that piece. If I'm trying to sell you a car, I'm going to talk about all the benefits and all those things. It is also where our memory happens and the language, thought, imagination happens. All of that happens sort of as you're looking down on it in that big third ring. It has a slower response time. So if you come back to like that emotional brain is pretty much about what's going on right now. The new neocortex or the neocortex smart brain is really more about thought process and taking time to figure things out. It is where our rational and logical systems come from. Again, back to that front piece. It also, interestingly enough, shuts down when the limbic system is in survival mode. So if you're out wandering around in the mountains, you're out hiking, and you come across a cougar, yeah, your smart brain shuts completely down. And your whole body and your brain go into survival mode. So the way I kind of like to talk about this too is we all remember from school doing like fire drills or something like that. The reason we do that, and this applies seriously to like first responders. The reason we practice what to do is because when we are in a fully stressful mode, like if there actually is a fire or for first responders, if something's happened, they need to know that information without thinking about it. Because the smart brain part, our neocortex, is pretty slow in response compared to the rest of the brain. So it's kind of the newer piece, but it's a little slower, but it's where we kind of are able to put those full pieces together. So how does the triune brain work in your relationship? So the really interesting thing to remember is the brain develops in order. When we're little, it's all back here. And so we have our brain stem and the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So it kind of develops from back here up and around the front. And when we start into our teen years, that's when that prefrontal cortex connects to the rest of the brain. The emotional brain is always the strongest in a perceived, not in a crisis, but in a perceived crisis. That emotional brain, that second layer out, is always going to kick in and be strongest because it's about surviving. It's about that, what do I do? It's instinct. The new cortex is the last piece to develop. And I hate to say this, and I know a lot of people get kind of frustrated with me, but emotion always wins out over logic because we make decisions based on how we feel, not on what we think. And we're going to talk a lot more about that moving forward into the next couple of sessions. All right, next we're moving on to autopilot and growth systems. All right, first is the X system. The X system is an auto reaction system of the brain. Okay, so you're kind of thinking, what are you talking about, X systems? We're going to talk about the C system too. So as neuroscientists, we've discovered a lot of different things, but we're not super creative when it comes to naming things. So the X system is basically our autopilot. It is auto reactions of the brain. It's what we do all the time. Its concern is being energy efficient. So like when we learn to brush our teeth as little kids, most of the time, if you've ever interacted with a little kid learning to brush their teeth, the first thing they do basically is eat the toothpaste. They don't actually get in and brush their teeth like we do. They eat the toothpaste because it usually tastes pretty good. But the X system, the autopilot system, its concern in our brain function is to be as super energy efficient as possible. Because again, if you remember, I said our brain uses most of our body's energy. It just wants things to happen as quickly as possible. It's not about, oh, let me think if I can use this or this. No, it's like, okay, this is how we've been set up for 20, 30, 50, 70 years. This is how this is going to go. It truly strives to be automatic. It really wants to be like the most well-oiled machine and things just flow the way they're supposed to flow. It works from old habits and patterns, which is where we get ourselves in trouble with the autopilot thing, is it really does go back to old habits and patterns that we've learned over time. And this is going to be really helpful in understanding with your relationships, especially with the relationship that you're in now and the reason you're taking this class. We work from old habits, always. Unless we're being more conscious of them and really trying to strive to change that. We all have patterns and habits from past relationships, from our childhood. And the last thing that the X system is interested in is that everything stays status quo. It doesn't want anything to change. And so when we're going to start to do something new, your brain is actually going to fight you because it wants everything to remain status quo. All right, moving on to the C system. Again, as neuroscientists, we are not all that great with naming things. But the C system is basically the growth system in the brain. It requires energy, requires a lot of energy. So if you stop to think, like when you were in school, or even if you're in school now and you're learning something, or at your job and you're learning something new, that's your C system. It is absolutely excited by learning new things, but learning things requires more neural energy. It requires the brain to work harder. It also processes things more slowly. That's why sometimes you're like, why can't I get this? Or you maybe learned a way to do things and then you're going through the steps and maybe you should forget step 5. That's because the C system struggles to process things really quickly, because what it's trying to do is build sort of an autopilot system. So basically, it's sort of engaging the autopilot system because it really wants to learn things, because eventually, when we're learning something, we want to transition it to the autopilot system so that we can learn and do it faster and faster. The other thing that the C system does is its main job is to challenge the habits and the belief systems of the X. The X system wants to stay the way it was, status quo. And by the way, we're going to learn in a couple of sessions that all of this happened before you were 12. And so the C system's job is really to challenge old habits and old beliefs. And it's very uncomfortable for your brain. It also does something called pruning. So if you're not using a portion of your brain, the brain actually goes in and sort of prunes it, gets rid of the pieces it doesn't need, and it repurposes parts of the brains that aren't being used. And the way I can kind of talk about this is, if you were sighted, you were born sighted, and then you lose your sight. Let's say something happens to your eyes. And so nothing's happened to the brain, but the eyes are no longer inputting signals to the brain. Remember, we talked about the occipital lobe back here, the vision, the visual cortex is back here. It now doesn't have a job, because its job was to interpret information through the eyes. And so it kind of hangs out for a little bit, and then it decides, oh, well, I guess I'm not going to get any information coming in here. So I kind of like to think about it like it's a little minion. It walks around to the other cortexes and says, hey, do you need help? And a lot of times what happens is it'll talk to the other cortexes and it'll be basically repurposed. So when they look at people who were sighted and now are not sighted anymore, and they are using Braille to read, a lot of times the information, the sensors, the sense that comes in through the fingers, instead of being processed normally, actually gets processed back in the visual cortex. The brain is very good about repurposing what it needs and how it needs to work so that it's using itself very effectively. And the last thing about the C system is that growth is key to emotional health. One of the things that as psychologists and neuropsychologists we understand is that when people feel stuck, it's because their X system is sort of running the show and they're not learning anything new. So if you feel stuck, that's your C system really trying to tell you that it wants to learn new things. It wants to do new things. All right. So these C and X systems and how they work in relationships. Remember, when you're in your relationship, you have default patterns. Is there something that you and your significant other fight about all the time? That's a default pattern. And they're automatic. And when you're going through this program, you're going to have to fight against some pretty heavy automatic patterns. We all have thought processes, whether it can be as simple as, a gender bias, like the guy is always supposed to take out the trash, or the woman is always supposed to do the dishes. It can be as simple as gender biases, but it can also be even more complex of, if he says this to you, it means this, or if she does this, it means that. Those are all patterns, and you're going to have to learn to fight against those patterns. The other thing we do is we make a ton of assumptions, all of us. So just remember, you make an assumption. If your significant other says something to you, you make an assumption. Do you always clarify or go investigate? Nope, you don't. Which is where we're going to talk about the X and the C system help us step back and process through those things. The last part is When the X and the C systems start to work together, we have a ton of growth as a person and in our relationship. All right, that's it for today's video. Your next steps: do the homework in your binder, make an appointment with your coach, and we'll see you soon.